Okay, so in doing this video, I realized that I've actually never done a video on Disney's Animal Kingdom. And so I was visiting the park to go to the new Pandora theme land in 2017 while I was presenting at IAPA, the big amusement park attractions expo in Orlando. And I said, I have to visit Animal Kingdom. And so I spent most of my time going to Pandora, but I also wanted to take in some of the other sites of the other theme lands, walking through Harambe, this fictionalized African town. And, you know, it just occurred to me when I was there that there's just so much marvelous stuff in the details, in the design of the theme lands. This is one of the eating areas I ate at. And you just see this richness here of all the design features, you know, to the walls, the facades, the faux patina, the signage, you know, the fake signs that are put up and everything, the signs of reuse, the focus on indigenous art. I mean, it really is, from a design standpoint, such a creative and immersive theme park. And it's an opportunity, I think, to think about to what extent this approach to design can be developed in other themed immersive spaces. Now, if you know about Disney Imagineering, they have this pretty cool set, and there's probably some new ones that I don't have. There's a lot of books on Imagineering, but books on Epcot, the Magic Kingdom, Hollywood Studios, California Adventure, Disneyland, and also Animal Kingdom. And what's pretty interesting about these books is they take you through the highlights, so they show you, this is before the Pandora theme expansion, which I guess was used to be what Camp Mini Mickey is what used to be in that theme area, which is now Pandora. So this takes you through some of the techniques to theming. It talks about the design approaches. It discusses goals and why they took some of the approaches that they did. And I think it's cool to read the Imagineering guides because they do give you insights about all that goes into creating the amazing themed immersive spaces that they create really in all their theme parks, retail spaces, and so forth. This is a shot I took, and this just shows you, I think, the level of detail in terms of the design. And you may maybe say it's not a big thing, but they've taken a poster here which is talking about the Harambe Wildlife Reserve. So again, their fictional ride, their not fictional ride, but their fictional theme land that they're giving life to. This, of course, is Kilimanjaro Safari, which is an amazing ride. I didn't get to go on it this time. I was kind of tired after going through Pandora because I spent over 5 hours there, and 4 hours of that was just going on, waiting in line and riding Flight of Passage. But again, this is the kind of shot that really reminds me of why Disney is so amazing at what they do. It takes a lot of money, but it also takes a lot of creativity to give these deliverables to the guests. Some of these things may not be directly noticed. A guest isn't necessarily going to, you know, these guests are not going to necessarily walk up and read this sign or say, wow, isn't it cool how you have this weathered effect and you have decay here and you have signs of reuse of posters being plastered on and things are decaying and there's patina and so forth going on here. But, you know, as you take everything in, it does have an effect, whether it's a subtle effect, an indirect effect, or a more direct effect. It's all about creating that spatial approach to immersion that's so important to guests when they visit theme parks. These are other examples of it, right? The bikes left here, the signs, some of the signs, you know, have like grammatically incorrect or spelling errors or whatever, so trying to create this sense of authenticity. But it really does, if you just look at it, right, it gives you a sense of a feel of a space that I think you don't get in too many other theme parks. You get it, you know, in some theme parks if they're willing to invest what is needed to be invested in terms of creating this level of immersion. So I'll take you through this video today going through Disney Animal Kingdom. I'm not going to talk about Pandora. I'll do that in a separate video. I'll talk about some of the emphasis on this micro level of theming and immersive design. I'll talk about ethnic arts. We'll discuss a little bit the critical insights we might have about primitivism and cultural stereotypes that sometimes we see in theme parks. We'll talk about education and this ability to deliver on the goals of focusing on conservation and ecologically sound messages to the guests. And you get a lot of that in the various rides as you go through Animal Kingdom. So it's been a long time that I've been wanting to do this, and so now let me take you through Animal Kingdom to give you more insights about why this is such an effective theme park in terms of theming and immersion of the guest. All right, so as we start the tour, I thought it might be appropriate to begin with this Michael Eisner quote from '98. "Welcome to a kingdom of animals, real, ancient, and imagined. A kingdom ruled by lions, dinosaurs, and dragons. A kingdom of balance, harmony, and survival. A kingdom we enter to share in the wonder, gaze at the beauty, thrill at the drama, and learn." So the mythical animals referred to here, the dinosaurs we actually have represented in one theme land. The other mythical ones, the dragons, sea monsters, and unicorns, were to have been part of a beastly kingdom, and a theme land that was never built. So my photos, by the way, are from 2008, and this was well before the opening, of course, Pandora. We had before Pandora in that spot, as you'll see on the map here in a second, Camp Mini Mickey. So that on the bottom left has now been replaced with Pandora, the world of Avatar. Now, when I visited in 2017, I didn't get a chance to, you'll see some images at the end of Harambe where I visited, and I also did the gorilla exploration trek through part of Africa. So you see that kind of north on the map there. But most of my time was spent at Pandora, and 4 hours and 15 minutes of that 5-hour visit or so to the park was spent in waiting in line at Flight of Passage. So this is the current map. So you can see again the one theme land that has changed is on the bottom there. Camp Mini Mickey becoming Pandora, the world of Avatar. And I think what's kind of cool looking at Eisner's quote from '98 is that with the exception of Dino Land, and again you could say it's like those are fictional in a sense, you know, they're very cartoony how they're presented in the theme land. Those mystical creatures were never really became a part of Disney's Animal Kingdom. And so I think bringing in Pandora is a nice homage, if you will, to that old era in which there were plans to do some mythical animals to be brought in here, which I think is kind of cool actually. In a conceptual sense. I think a lot of purists are always thinking, well, a zoo or even a zoo theme park hybrid like Animal Kingdom needs to sort of stick to the traditional focus on flora and fauna and ecosystems and science and so forth. But as a hybrid, as we're looking at pictures from the Asian theme land, again, these are all from 2008. I'll let you know at the end when we get to some current ones. So things have of course changed. But I think one of the issues to look at in Animal Kingdom is this issue of the theme park zoo hybrid. If you read scholars like Jan-Erik Steinkruger, who is part of one of my current books, edited collection, he's studied zoos, and he makes the point that zoos in the past, beginning with many of the early German zoos, were focused on actually this construction of nature and using artificiality, whether it was for telling a story, creating a diorama. By the way, I'll talk about this later, so kind of remember this when we get to some future versions of these misspellings on these supposedly authentic signs. But so in other words, zoos have always been in this project of constructing nature and telling stories about flora and fauna, the plants, the animals, and creating these entities, these zoo enclosures that offer not just containment of animals, but also offer a particular identity or a form of storytelling about animals, a storytelling that gets into the identities of animals. And of course, we have all our perceptions about, if you get into animal studies, about we impart on animals our own ideologies and onto nature and so forth. We're looking here at some images. I always love, like the utilitarian features, just some of the signposts that we're looking at, the signage, utility poles, things that are made to look old, things that are made to look weathered, things that are made to look maybe more authentic or in tune with a particular environment, a particular cultural place. A second issue to consider in addition to this issue of the zoo theme park hybrid, as we look at some of the drumming that's connected to the African theme land, is the issue of cultural essence and stereotyping. I've done another video recently on Fantasia Land where I talk about this issue more broadly, so you can check that one out on YouTube. But basically, I refer to principles of what I call culture sampling. So in other words, you take bits and pieces of other cultures, other places, folkways, design schema, color patterns, real places and you repurpose them, you recreate them in new ways in the new place. Much has always been made of the fact that when Animal Kingdom was in the design stage, Imagineers went to, and I can't tell you where in Africa or Asia, but they tried to have, on the ground experiences. And this is always a facet of Joel Bergman when in the Immersive Worlds, when they were talking about designing some of the theme casinos, they talk about going to, quote, the real places to get inspired and to bring back design principles of various sorts. Here's a cool, I like in these sorts of theme parks, those hybrids of the real and the fictive in terms of that plant. And then I have this poaching sign here. We're actually coming up on Kilimanjaro Safari, which this is one of the tracks on the ride. It's a remarkable ride, I have to say, but there's a very heavy conservation focus. And in some of my previous work, I've spoken about this. Also, Kali River Rapids, which has a lot about deforestation and negative effect on the environment. But there's a narrative when you go through Kilimanjaro Safari, which we're looking at here. And again, as a zoo experience, I have to say, when I was riding these these hybrid ride vehicles, and this is kind of a nice feature there, so you get this sense of going through kind of like constructed environments of various sorts. But it's cool when you go through this and the animals come up so close to you. Now this is part of the story. I believe the elephant is named Baby, so these poachers have kidnapped this elephant, and there's sort of a happy ending at the end of the ride. Now, when they originally created this ride, they had a very dark ending. And I was writing about this saying, maybe Disney should have stuck with the darker ending of it. But this is another side, I think, of looking at this particular zoo theme park hybrid is the issue of conservation and education. Just look at the shot there. This is this giraffe. They come right up to the vehicle. I mean, it's really quite amazing where they break down this sense of enclosure or disconnection from the animals. I mean, the rhinos come right up. It's just quite a stunning experience, I think, in a theme park or in a zoo. I mean, you don't typically see something like this. And we're looking at some more of the signage here. In the next few slides, we'll feature, I think, some of the nice plays they've done on indigenous art, on bricolage, on bringing in sort of this folk art tradition into the theme park in some ways. And it has, I think, a rather folksy, homey kind of feel to it in terms of many of the enclosures. We're looking at some of the Asian theming here that is part of the Expedition Everest, the Himalayan Yeti ride. And this is one of my favorite queue houses in the whole park. It's quite astonishing. Now with Pandora, of course, the queue house game has been risen to an even higher level. But this is, I think, a very good queue house in terms of what we see here on the ride. And as we look at some of these features, I mentioned earlier the issue of stereotyping and essentialism, and I think it's always a facet of theme park design to think about. Again, in my video on Phantasialand, I talk about this in a little more detail, but it's important when we go through Asia, when we go through Africa here at Animal Kingdom. I think we should reflect on what essences are being communicated to us. In the case of Africa, with the Harambe village, they've done something which is a little different, so creating a fictional place. The same thing with the Asian village, which in Sanskrit means a place of delights. We're just looking here at the dramatic drop as you exit, the escape from the Yeti. Here's some more of the signage. Anandapura is, again, the name of the fictional town. And so it's in a sense maybe one clever way of, we're looking at the vistas of the Himalayas. You'll see another version of this when you go to Disney's California Adventure, when you go into the new Cars Land themed area with some of the features there with the Cadillac Mountains and so forth. This is, the traditional Walt Disney weenie. So the weenie is the idea that it calls you from afar and you see it, and it sort of helps with the flow through a given theme park. Discovery Island, and of course the Tree of Life also has that feature to it, being in the center, the sort of hub, and all the spokes coming out. So we're looking at some of the dinosaur theming. And I have to say, I think whenever I see dinosaur theming anywhere, or dinosaur replicas, or dinosaur educational efforts, whether it's in museums or in theme parks, I always, I guess, have a little bit of suspicion, because I think a lot of this is driven by a desire to sell toys, certain types of stories about dinosaurs. And it's kind of funny to think about. I think of Werner Herzog's work on nature, not on dinosaurs per se, but he writes a lot or talks a lot about his documentaries and feature films about sort of nature as an unruly force and not a happy force. And I'm thinking of some narrative in the very harrowing film Grizzly Man, the documentary about Timothy Treadwell. But I'm saying this because I think sometimes we have a narrative of dinosaurs as, very happy and friendly. Of course, Jurassic Park, the movie and video game experiences, it's not maybe as happy. They're actually villains in many of those movies. But in the case of theming here, it's like the friendly dinosaurs and a particular narrative that, of course, from a cultural studies standpoint, attaches to consumption. So I don't know. The dinosaur theming, the dinosaur theme land, I'm not sure if I'm totally convinced that it works, but that's my perception. You may think differently. You see some of the additional, the previous slide was like a fence, I guess, a girder, and then we saw light poles and more of these like utilitarian features. I just love the sign there, the weathering of the sign, the rust on it, what they do to the outside surfaces of buildings, using rust here as a design focus, a design aesthetic. I think Animal Kingdom in many ways has some of the best uses of things like patina and the idea of ruins. We'll see some ruins a little bit later through one of the walk-through zoo conservation areas. Look at these doors here. These are quite, I think, innovative and cool to look at aesthetically. And that's one of the nice features, I think. We're seeing some of the ruins here of Animal Kingdom. One of the nice features of it is this fact that they've focused on bringing in a lot of indigenous design aesthetic principles. Again, the use of weathering, the faux ruins, the sense of decay that you see. For me, it's just a wonderful way to experience time and sort of psychological perceptions of time and temporality in a theme park setting. For the cultural critic, of course, a lot of this is a concern because there's always the feeling that if a guest sees this, they'll think that something that is not really old is old. And I think we have to give guests a little more credit. I mean, it's not as if every single guest who visits a theme park is really stupid and uneducated, and they can't have these perceptions. It's a fantasy construction of time. B, you walk through any city, whether it's in Europe. I mean, there are a lot of cities. Freiburg, Germany is a place, for example, that is made to look really old, but is actually fairly recent. And so Europe in particular, I think, because of World War II, has done a lot of reconstruction. And as a result, sometimes we see facades in so-called real cities that are maybe not real or not as old as we perceive them to be. And that's, something, of course, part of the theme park complex. We saw some images of the Tree of Life there when this park opened. There was a lot of emphasis on the construction of it. I've always thought it was kind of a curious construct in terms of what is there, and how these animals are represented in the tree trunk. It's a very kind of abstract, non-representational take on a tree. So, I mean, it's very different in that sense. We're looking at some more of the structures as we walk through the park. I'm not taking you through like sequentially. I've just picked some of my favorites. And again, these are all from 2008. I was looking at my Flickr account recently for Animal Kingdom, and I think it's somewhere around 700 images, maybe 100 or so from my last visits to Pandora in 2017, and then a little bit of tracking through Harambe, but most of these that you're seeing are from 2008, as I mentioned earlier. I always think this is interesting. I mentioned this in my video on Phantasialand. You have this sign here of Africa, and it's just always, curious, right, from a theming perspective when you represent an entire continent and you try to do this in a theme land. Cultural critics again would say that it's a failed attempt because you cannot capture all the diversity that is in any given city or a culture or a region, not to mention an entire continent. And so I think it's one of the challenges of looking at theming in general is how we sample places and identities and cultures and folkways and recreate them in these new ways. I mentioned earlier, so there's like a lot of, if you read this sign, a lot of typos there and grammatically incorrect stuff. And certainly you see this, like I've traveled many places around the world and I've seen these sorts of signs where there are errors and so forth. And anywhere you go, you could see these. And I guess I wonder just like what your take is on that from an authenticity standpoint, if you think it's charming, if you think it maybe, I don't know, just what your viewpoints might be. So you can offer some of your opinions maybe in the comments on YouTube here. Now, this is part of the Kilimanjaro Safari, and it's kind of interesting going back to the theme of conservation education. So you go through some of those back areas and you see how the animals are being treated. When this park opened and plans were discussed back in the day, you know, in the late 90s, and then the opening through the 2000s since the park has been open, I think a lot of discussion by conservation groups and groups focused on, you know, animal welfare and so forth. It would probably be an hour discussion just to get into some of these issues, and I'm sure you have varied opinions on this. By the way, we're now looking at, these are the 2017 images of Harambe, so these are my most current photos. But basically, some concerns about the treatment of animals and are they treated ethically. I've read opinions on both sides of the issue, so, you know, again, I think this is good fodder for debate here. But again, looking at Harambe as we close out the video today, I think this gives you a wonderful display of just how colorful and inviting many of the atmospheres and spaces are here in Animal Kingdom. And Harambe, for me, is very charming in terms of what they've done with some of the design features. I really love this shot here. I think it's just a great shot of creating an atmosphere using some of those techniques of age and time and weathering of the signs, putting in the utilitarian objects, and really giving us that sense of a space that has a kind of a, I guess I would say, a homey feel to it and an authentic feel to it. And this is one of the walkthrough areas that you can take, and it's, I think, harkening back to the echoing back rather to the traditional era of zoos, perhaps, which Disney is a reminder here, Animal Kingdom, of the possibilities of combining zoos and theme parks in one form. So we'll bring the video to a close, and please do come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.